Me again. Going to talk to you about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Thought this was a really cool image. Hopefully you can look at this image of a cadaver and realize that you are looking at what type of section, dividing into a left and right, so it's a sagittal section. And also, hopefully you can identify some of the structures. Of course, you should be able to find the brain. And this little white band of tissue here is the corpus callosum. This particular area in the brain is the hypothalamus. Extending down from the hypothalamus, you have a little strip of tissue, and then hanging from that strip of tissue, you have the pituitary gland. So we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between these two glands, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So let's begin first by clarifying something about the master gland. For many years it was thought that the pituitary gland was the master gland because it secretes hormones that affect many other glands. But you will soon find out that the master has a master, and the hypothalamus is the true master because it secretes hormones that control the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland in turn secretes hormones that control other glands. Okay, so the pituitary gland, both the anterior and posterior, are controlled in some way by the hypothalamus, and you'll see that those two ways are very different as we continue our discussion. All right, so let's look at the little cartoon image now. Of course, up here you have the hypothalamus, and the lower part of the image is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is divided into an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary, two very distinct glands in the tissue that they are composed of, as well as the way that they are controlled by the hypothalamus and the way that they secrete their hormones. So let's begin with the posterior pituitary first, okay? So beginning in the hypothalamus, you see that you have neurons up here. Those neurons are going to be making the hormones for the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the neurons synthesize the posterior pituitary hormones. Those hormones then travel down axons in this little stalk. Okay, so this stalk between the two is known as the infundibulum. Big word, little stalk. Okay, so the infundibulum is the tissue comprised of the blood vessels and the nerves that are the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So you've got neurons up here in the hypothalamus making your posterior pituitary hormones, and then those hormones are going to travel down the axons and then be stored in the hypothalamus. Okay? They're stored in the hypothalamus and then they are secreted from the hypothalamus. All right. Remember, your posterior pituitary hormones are going to be made in the hypothalamus, travel down the axons in the infundibulum, and then they're stored in the posterior pituitary. I think I said stored in the hypothalamus a while ago. That's not right if that's what I said. They're made in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay, then when those hormones need to be released, they're released into this capillary bed, and then, of course, out to the bloodstream, out to the body. All right, we'll talk more about those hormones in just a moment. So now let's change colors, and we'll go with red. Now the anterior pituitary, okay, so this is our anterior pituitary over here, makes and secretes its own hormones. A little bit different there, okay? So these epithelial cells in here are going to make and secrete hormones. But those hormones are under the control of the hypothalamus, okay? So up here we have neurons in the hypothalamus that are going to stimulate the release of other hormones. Okay, so neurons are going to make trophic hormones. Trophic means to cause a changing, okay? So trophic hormones are going to be released into the capillary beds. Okay, so this capillary bed that's in the infundibulum is getting all these hormones from these other neurons in the hypothalamus. Now, those hormones from the hypothalamus are going to travel through this portal system or this network of blood vessels down to these epithelial cells in the anterior pituitary. Okay, so these cells are endocrine cells because they make and secrete hormones. Okay, so these hormones that come down through the bloodstream are going to tell these endocrine cells, secrete your hormones, and they do so into the bloodstream where they travel out to other targets. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about what's going on here. So the hypothalamus is controlling the anterior pituitary by releasing hormones that are either going to cause other hormones to be released, so they're releasing hormones, or inhibit hormones from being released, okay? So hypothalamus releases these hormones that target the anterior pituitary. If they have a releasing effect, they cause the anterior pituitary to secrete hormones. You can identify that with a positive. If it inhibits further release of hormones, a negative sign shows that it inhibits. So let's look at the inhibiting hormones first. We have somatostatin and prolactin inhibiting hormones that are going to come from the hypothalamus, target the pituitary gland, and prevent the pituitary gland from releasing growth hormone or prolactin. Okay, your releasing hormones or releasing factors are going to stimulate the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus secretes the releasing hormones, it targets the anterior pituitary, and causes the anterior pituitary to release hormones. Now you're going to learn each one of these, but I'll give you just a brief overview. Your corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary and tells it to release growth hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the thyroid gland and tells it to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And prolactin releasing factor from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary, which releases prolactin, which targets the breast. All right, so you see there's quite a bit going on there, but it's not that difficult to understand. Just remember, your releasing hormones are going to stimulate the pituitary, and your inhibiting hormones are going to prevent the pituitary from releasing further hormones. All right, so looking at that in a different view. Okay, here, these tubes represent the bloodstream. Let me change colors here so we can see it a little better. Okay, these tubes represent the bloodstream, okay? So in the first tube, we have hormones released from the hypothalamus. Let me erase this so we can see it a little better. Okay, hormones released from the hypothalamus, okay, into the bloodstream, okay? And it shows their action on the anterior pituitary, okay? So these, the second tube here, these are the hormones that are going to be released by the anterior pituitary as a result of those hormones from the hypothalamus. So you can see once again, you've got your positives and your negatives, okay? Growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary and tells it to release growth hormone. Somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone. Then growth hormone targets bone, muscle, and adipose tissue and causes growth by mitosis. Prolactin releasing factor from the hypothalamus has a stimulating effect. Okay, so it causes the anterior pituitary to release prolactin, which targets the breast. Prolactin inhibiting factor from the anterior pituitary tells from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary, don't release prolactin. Thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary and tells it to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which then targets the thyroid gland and tells it to release thyroid hormones. Corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary, tells it to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex, which then releases several different hormones. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary, which releases luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, which target the gonads. The gonads are the ovaries and the testes, which then are going to start creating gametes, sperm cells and egg cells, and also secreting estrogen or testosterone. All right, so you had heard me mention in a previous video about pathways that regulate secretion. So this is a wonderful little study tool to help you remember those pathways, what hormones regulate the release of other hormones, and what the eventual targets are. Okay, what's next? Hypothalamic control over the posterior pituitary. Now remember, we said that there are no releasing or inhibiting hormones. Instead, the hypothalamus produces two hormones that are then sent through those axons of those nerve cells to be stored in the posterior pituitary, okay? Those two hormones are antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin, and oxytocin. So those two hormones are simply going to be stored and released when the body needs them. Antidiuretic hormone, antidiuretic. What's a diuretic do? Diuretic makes you pee, right? So an antidiuretic causes you to retain water so that you urinate less. Oxytocin is going to have several important functions, but one of the main functions is to cause smooth muscle contraction during childbirth. All right, I think that's all I've got for you. Let me check. Nope. Darn. Need to talk just a little bit about the development of these two. Now, we've talked about them being very different in the way that the hypothalamus works on them. And we also talked about the different ways that they make and secrete their hormones. Well, they're also very different histologically, or according to the tissue from which they're made and what they're made of. Okay, so your anterior pituitary gland. Now remember, it's composed of glandular tissue, epithelial tissues that make and secrete hormones, okay? Adeno means glandular. Hypophysis is the big fancy name for pituitary. You may see hypophysis cerebri. Okay, so hypophysis cerebri is pituitary gland. The adeno or adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary, made of epithelial tissues that pouch upward, push upward from the roof of the mouth. So it's made of the same type of tissue. Now your posterior pituitary, remember it's made up of nervous tissue. It's the neurohypophysis, okay? So neurohypophysis composed of nervous tissue. And remember, you've got the axons from the hypothalamus coming down in there. So during embryological development, the hypothalamus pouches downward and forms the posterior pituitary. So two very distinct glands that are commonly called one gland. But now you know that it is truly two very different glands, the anterior and posterior pituitary. Talk to you next time.